Hello and welcome to the Manfred Olson Planetarium virtual programming. My name is Jean Creighton. I'm the director of the planetarium, and I'm very happy to have you with us. It is my pleasure to introduce the final installment in our series, Culturas Celestiales. Culturas Celestiales. That we are going to wrap up with Puerto Rico. And it is my pleasure to introduce Nancy Beers Soto, who is a professor of Spanish in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I might add, a very good friend of the planetarium. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Nancy to discuss the connection between the culture and astronomy in her homeland.
Well, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. I am delighted to present about cultural aspects regarding Puerto Rico and its connection to the stars. But first, I would like to acknowledge as a Puerto Rican who lives outside of Puerto Rico, my particular context as a bilingual Puerto Rican holding a PhD and who is a professor at UWM. And my presentation here is connected to a very dear place, my native Puerto Rico. So moving on then to contextualizing Latin America and the Caribbean, and we can take a look at a map. And well, there was a picture of me trying to hold the sun. And I have a quote here that is from a, sure.
So yes, I just want to,
yeah. So that is actually in Old San Juan, and I'm trying to catch the sun. So I have a quote here from 1914 from a labor leader that says that every living being radiates like a star. So with that, let's get into the context, visualizing Puerto Rico in the context of the Caribbean and Latin America. So, and again, very briefly, so the Caribbean is this region that has a very rich and very complex history. We have the indigenous populations, then we have the history of colonization, slavery, and also the different migrations that take place. And from that region that is not just islands, but it's also, the coast of Central America and South America. And we could argue also like, New Orleans and parts of Florida. So we have the three former Spanish colonies, and those are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. And these are Spanish-speaking countries. And specifically for this presentation, I will concentrate on Puerto Rico. So just to get situated so that we can visualize, and we usually refer to Puerto Rico as an island, but it's actually an archipelago, right? We have the Isla Grande, the big island, which was called Boriquen by the Taínos. And we have Vieques, Culebra, and other small islands around. So we have at the north, we have San Juan, the capital city, and as many cities in the world, it has its Calle Sol. And then in the south, we have Ponce, which is another major city that we will be talking about briefly, as it also has a Calle Sol. And there's something else connected to Ponce later on in the presentation. So that's Puerto Rico. We see here also in this map on the west coast, there's an area called Puerta del Sol. And this is actually connected to this was a campaign by the tourism company to bring tourism to the west of Puerto Rico, which has fabulous beaches and resorts, and just the sunsets there are pretty spectacular. If you ever get to be on the southwestern tip in Cabo Rojo, that's just an amazing, beautiful place. So again, these maps to visualize and get us situated, and then we can continue and think about, for instance, in this case, here in Old San Juan, here we have the layout of the streets. Here in Old San Juan, on the north, we see the Atlantic Ocean. And right there, we can see the Calle Sol, or the Street of the Sun. And right below it, parallel to it, is the Calle Luna, right? The street of the moon. And, you know, so that you can visualize there Old San Juan specifically, which is the capital of Puerto Rico with a lot of rich history. And from there, we can continue and think a little bit more about Puerto Rico in a historical context. So just to give an overview on this, of course, it's going to be very brief, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. So in 1898, at the end of the Spanish-American War, so Spain loses its last colonies, and then that is the moment in which Puerto Rico ceases to be a Spanish colony and becomes a US territory, okay? So that's 1898. And then in 1917, that is the year that Puerto Ricans actually are granted US citizenship. And that is through the Jones Act. So that's 1917. And then there's 1952, which is the year in which the current status of Puerto Rico, the so-called Commonwealth, was ratified. So we see that for the first half of the 20th century, it's pretty much, you know, this idea of being a territory and then being a Commonwealth. Yet, you know, we see that this is a complex status, you know, being a territory of the US. And this is also going to come into play later on when we talk about one of the celebrations of the holiday. So keep in mind that, yes, Puerto Ricans are US citizens. At the same time, there's a sense of nationality and cultural affinity for Puerto Ricans. And then I also have here another date that is 2017, and that's the year of Hurricane Maria that actually made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 20th. And that was pretty much a before and after moment, which, I mean, that was a sustained emergency and crisis for many months, for some people almost a year, without power and without access. So that was another moment that propelled a lot of migration away from Puerto Rico. And now mostly it's to places like Orlando. There's been a lot of migrations, Puerto Rican migration to the US throughout the 20th century, and now most recently to places in Florida. So Hurricane Maria was one of those moments that really struck a chord for people both in Puerto Rico and also for the Puerto Ricans or the Boricuas in the diaspora. So with that, there is a poem by Juan Antonio Correger that the title is Boricua en la Luna. And that, poem has been turned into a song by Roy Brown, Boricua en la Luna. And I wanted to talk about this first because, well, the translation is just beautiful, right? The idea of being a Boricua on the moon. And here the idea is that, or the sentiment is that you are Boricua, you have that cultural, national identity and affinity, regardless of where you're born. So it's not actually tied to a physical location. And in the poem, in the song, we see that it is actually a history of migration of a town in Puerto Rico in the Northwest, at Aguadilla, and going to New York City, which was one of the main places for Puerto Rican migration throughout the 20th century, something that was actually propelled both by the Puerto Rican government and also the federal government. So there is a very deep connection between Puerto Rico and New York City and other cities in the US. And that's why jokingly sometimes people say that Manhattan is yet another part of the Puerto Rican archipelago. Also with the term Boricua, this relates to another aspect of that cultural affinity, that the word Boricua actually comes from the Taino name for Puerto Rico, which was Boriquen, Boriken. So this is a way to connect to Puerto Rico in a pre-colonization, pre-Hispanic fashion, and to actually highlight that indigenous foundation that, you know, it's not as prominent as is in other parts of Latin America, but it is important, and there shouldn't be any erasure about it. And also the fact that Boricua is also a term that many Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, Puerto Ricans, you know, New York or Chicago and places in the US, they really attach to this cultural marker, because it also brings in that sense that not just the cultural affinity, but a lot of the people who have to migrate, like they're forced to migrate, is either usually because they come from a lower socioeconomic status, or they're usually people who are not part of the more so-called whitewashing or white passing type of Puerto Rican. So it's also a way to create that awareness about indigeneity and Afro-Caribbean roots. So Boricua, okay, and this sense again that it doesn't matter where you're born, a Boricua is a Boricua regardless, even if you were born on the moon. And here in this image, and that was from, you know, the Puerto Rican flag, it is one of those cultural markers that really allows Puerto Ricans to mark that sense of identity. Okay, so yes, let's talk more about the Taínos, the Taíno Indians. So from the Taínos to the present, and talking a little bit about archaeoastronomy. So here I'm actually basing this segment on an article by Ángel Rodriguez from 2013. And the idea here is that the Taínos were actually major observers of the night sky. And they were following and watching different constellations and making the correlation between the constellations and the seasons. So here with this image, this is actually, sorry, a ceremonial ball court called Jacana, or in the area called Jacana, which is actually in the north part of the municipality of Ponce. Now, Ponce is that city that is on the south coast of Puerto Rico, and it used to be the second largest city. Now, you know, of course, San Juan is a bigger metropolitan area, and then Caguas is there trying to fight for the second largest city. But Ponce has a lot of history that goes with it, and you know, prominent families and writers in Puerto Rico. So Jacana is in the municipality of Ponce, so not the city proper. And here in this map, we can see more of the Taínos and how, again, how they were the observers of the night sky. So the north and the south walls are actually aligned with the heliacal rising of the Pleiades in late May, around May 29th. And that signals the beginning of a rainy season, okay? So usually the first part of the year tends to be very dry. So here is signaling that rainy season. And this happens actually a month before the summer solstice. Then the south wall actually faces the setting of Ursa Major after sunset in September, mid to late September, which is the time of the year associated with major hurricane activity. And if we look at the trajectory of some of the strongest hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico, I can think for myself, you know, living there, 1989, Hurricane Hugo, September 18th. And like I mentioned, in 2017, Hurricane Maria, that was September 20th. So of course, if you live in an island in the Caribbean, you need to watch for and be on the lookout for this type of thing, for hurricane. And also interesting to note that the word hurricane, huracán, comes from huracán, which is actually something that Taínos gave us and the world. They gave us that term, right? So then here with this image, the east wall faces the setting of Ursa Major, which is associated then with like the second rainy season that comes after the height, you know, from hurricane season onwards. And pretty much the petroglyphs from the west are actually aligned with the Pleiades. So we see that the Pleiades, Ursa Major, and I'm sure other constellations were key for Taínos. And I think it's very interesting how this, you know, this sense of thinking of the Taínos as observers of the night sky, it's very important. So yes, now celebrations, celestial celebrations. So I mentioned briefly the summer solstice, right? That comes a month after May, the Pleiades rising, right, around May 29th. So the summer solstice is around June 21st usually. And one major kind of like legendary folkloric celebration that it's connected to the summer solstice is the Noche de San Juan, the night of San Juan. And this, in this case, San Juan, just like the city, is referring to St. John the Baptist. So this is the feast of St. John the Baptist. And this takes place on June 23rd. Some people would say, yeah, that is the longest night, depending, right, because it's around the solstice. So it is celebrated on June 23rd. And the idea here, or the celebration, is that people go to the beach like late in the afternoon. So they are there after sunset. You stay until at least midnight. That's part of the huge celebration, to stay until midnight at the very least, because legend has it, or the folklore around it, is that you have to swim, and if you have to sort of like jump backwards as you swim, and then if you turn, you can see your future. So that's the legend around it. So it's a huge party, June 23rd, to be out on the beach partying pretty much all night. So there's the solstice, and then about a month later, there is cultural celebration, La Fiesta de Santiago Apóstol. Now, Santiago Apóstol in English, it's actually St. James. And this is a celebration that highlights and accentuates the Afro-Caribbean roots, in this case, especially in the town of Loíza, which is not too far from the airport on the North Coast. So it's actually celebrating, highlighting the Afro-Caribbean roots of Puerto Rican culture and society. And this is a celebration that connects also people in Puerto Rico with people in the diaspora, as the celebration actually travels between both places, so to speak. So we can take a listen at that. Okay, so we have seen a few elements that actually have to do with cultural affinity and also like a sense of resistance, right? We saw an image of the Puerto Rican flag. I mentioned, Puerto Rico being a Spanish-speaking country, just like, with Cuba and the Dominican Republic as former Spanish colonies. Celebrating the Taino past and the Afro-Caribbean roots, so all these elements that make Puerto Rico what it is. So here is the question now that it's also connected to another element that I'll be talking about briefly. But here's the question I'm gonna throw at the audience first to see if they agree or not. And the question is, does Puerto Rico actually have the longest holiday season of all? So here, we have an image of the three wise men, or the three kings, right? And that's actually, well, the Epiphany, and that's celebrated on January 6th. And this is a celebration that is very important. It's very important in Puerto Rico and for Puerto Rican culture. The Three Kings Day, Los Reyes Magos, right? El Día de Reyes. It's a celebration that is very, it's not unique to Puerto Rico. It's celebrated in other countries. You have the Rosca de Reyes in other countries. But it's very unique in the sense that it connects to that Puerto Rican sense of, this is a way to show that it's not about cultural assimilation. It's a celebration that, we don't have here necessarily as big or, as prominent in the United States. So there's a photo of me when I was, I don't know, 4 or 5. So it's been a while. And I'm pretty sure that's a photo with some of the stuff I got from the Reyes Magos. So the longest holiday season. So around this time of year, when we see Orion, right? And think of Orion when we start seeing it here in Milwaukee, that it's kind of low in the sky, right? If you go to Puerto Rico this time of year, now in November, Orion is going to be high up in the sky. And the three stars that are the belt of Orion, when you see them, usually in Puerto Rico call them los tres Reyes Magos, so the three wise men or the three kings. So starting in November, when you see Orion really high up in the sky, you start thinking of you getting into the holiday spirit, right? And then US holidays are also celebrated there. So you get into Thanksgiving, and then you go into, of course, Christmas Day and New Year's. And then you get to January 6th with the Three Kings, which again, it's one of those key celebrations because for a while in the 20th century, there were markers of Puerto Rican culture that were actually not allowed to be shown or to take place. Like, for instance, in the 20th century, at some point, instruction had to take place in English, in that sense, displacing Spanish, or the intent or the effort to displace Spanish. There was a time when even showing a Puerto Rican flag would have made you be seen as a subversive. So all of these markers, right, like language and the flag and the Three Kings are ways for Puerto Ricans, for Puerto Rican culture, and also using the term Boricua to affirm that cultural affinity, regardless of, there's citizenship, but there's also that national connection. And so after Three Kings Day, and that's another day when kids receive presents, and it's a party. Actually, you don't go back to school until at least the 8th. And if the 8th falls on a Friday, you don't go back to school until a few days later. So then there's February 2nd, El Día de la Candelaria. And I have an image here of the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Candelaria in Mayagüez, which is on the West Coast, part of that Porta del Sol. So that would be Groundhog Day or Imbolc. It has different names in different cultures. And that's the day when people, like they do in other places, maybe that's the day where you take out the old Christmas tree to make a bonfire. So if we think of, since November, Orion high up in the sky, and getting gifts from Santa Claus, and then New Year's, and then getting gifts from the Three Kings, and then wrapping it up around February 2nd, is this the longest holiday season? That's for you to decide. So let's talk about some success, right? More celestial success. And let's talk about Arecibo, the Arecibo Observatory. That was actually, so it was inaugurated in 1963. And sadly, it collapsed almost a year ago. And it was really heartbreaking. I don't know if you've watched the clip of seeing that platform, seeing all of that collapse. It was very heartbreaking, but I think it's important to remember that a lot of the science, a lot of the data that came from Arecibo is still, it's still in use, it's still very valid, it's very important. And I just wanted to highlight some of the many wonderful things that came from the observatory. From that, there was a point in which it was the biggest radio telescope in the world. So just a few samples of the successes that we got from Arecibo. It actually discovered the rotation rate of Mercury, that it's actually 59 days as opposed to 88 that people thought it was. And then I know this is a term that it's very scientific, and it's the idea of the binary pulsar. So as Jean would mention to me, this is, a way to describe it would be to think of a binary pulsar, to think of stars dancing around each other. So that would be kind of like the poetic way of seeing at it. It actually discovered the first ever binary pulsar, and there was a Nobel Prize in Physics connected to that. Arecibo discovered the first ever exoplanet. And Arecibo discovered the first ever repeating fast radio burst. There is a lot more. So it's good to know that even if the structure collapsed, that all that data, all that information is still relevant, and people are still working with that data. So from that sad story of the collapse, there's actually some good news quite recently from this past August. And it's that, so astronomy is actually alive and kicking in Puerto Rico. So the first ever satellite made in Puerto Rico, the first ever Puerto Rican satellite, was actually launched into space in August through SpaceX. And this was done by a group of students from the Inter-American University, the Bayamón campus, which is part of the metro area. And these are actually students from the School of Engineering. So we have a very short clip. It's in Spanish, right? It's good to listen to some Spanish, and then I'll just talk a little bit about it in English afterwards.
Por primera vez, Puerto Rico tendrá la oportunidad de lanzar un satélite al espacio. El satélite Puerto Rico CubeSat NanoRocks 2 es un proyecto de un equipo compuesto por estudiantes y el profesor Amílcar Rincón Charris del recinto de Bayamón de la Universidad Interamericana de Puerto Rico. El satélite pesa 5.6 libras y está construido en aluminio, celdas fotovoltaicas, baterías y otros materiales aprobados para utilizarse en el espacio. El Puerto Rico CubeSat.
Okay, so this satellite, again, it's something very exciting, right? The idea of having the first ever Puerto Rican satellite. It was made by students, and also to consider that it's expected to be operational, to be in orbit for about 2 years. So we'll see hopefully some good updates coming from that. So that was, some of the good news in terms of the science also that I wanted to share. And then, so I know I've talked about different aspects here, some things related to history and the Taino past and Afro-Caribbean roots and the celebrations that start off with the Orion constellation up in the sky. But also getting back to kind of like how I connect to the culture, right? And also being a professor of literature. I just wanted to add some components that are more, in the poetic and musical aspect of things. So there is a poet, her name is Julia de Burgos, and she's one of the foremost Puerto Rican poets. She was fierce, she was quite a feminist. She actually passed away. She was actually part of that early diaspora, so to speak, in New York City. So here I have just a sample from an excerpt from the poem The Sea and You. And, with the aurora having that sense of, the importance of sunrise. And it says, all the color of awakened aurora, may the sea and you expand it into a dream, that it carry my ship of seagulls and leave me in the water of two skies. So here, there's some elements that I want to highlight aside from, the sunrise, and it's the importance of water, because water also connects to the Afro-Caribbean imagery, especially the connection to the sea and some of the orishas, and Yemaya. So there's actually that type of connection, even if subtle, expanded into a dream. And the idea of leave me in the water of two skies, that could also be, we could also see a metaphor there of being in the water, right, in between the two skies, of the Puerto Rican sky and the New York City sky. She's a poet from the 20th century. And again, getting into this topic of how migration is so key to the Puerto Rican experience, right? Sometimes it's voluntary, but oftentimes it's actually forced due to socioeconomic issues that have been made worse after Hurricane Maria and more recently. So that water between two skies and that connection, right, again, through the water, which also connects to some of the Taino imagery of seeing like a sea or like a serpent in the Milky Way, kind of like what a few weeks ago when David Pacifico was talking about Peru. So some of these metaphors are actually going deep into aspects of Puerto Rican history and culture. You have an image of her. She was amazing. So The Sea and You is actually one of her most wonderful poems. And there's one also that she has about the Rio Grande de Loíza, which is one of the rivers that is actually not too far from Loíza on the northeast side of Puerto Rico. Northeast from San Juan. So Here, and this is kind of actually to conclude my my presentation, there is this band, Fiel a la Vega, that they became quite famous in the late 90s. And this is more like rock in Spanish, with influence from other Latin American and Caribbean writers. And in one of their songs, which is actually pretty long, at the very end, they have this beautiful image of being someone who's actually looking at the sky and feeling humble, like, wow, all the wonder in the skies and the cosmos. So I can actually read if with the Spanish. I'll actually read the Spanish because these are actually the lyrics. And then I'll read my translation. And again, I'm not a translator, but so that we can convey the message. So this is how the song ends. Y hoy me acuesto ante el cielo y siento cosquillas en mi ser. Y me río de mí mismo ante tanta sencillez. Lejos de mí las estrellas quedarán, pues solo así las puedo ver brillar. And my translation, and today I lie down facing the sky, and I feel the tingling, and I laugh at myself in the face of so much simplicity. Far away from me, the stars will remain, since only thus I can see them shine. Okay, so that sense of just enjoying the cosmos, and from a song from a contemporary band, kind of like my generation. So yeah, so I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and I can, if you want me to go back and elaborate more or clarify something, I'll be happy to take any questions. So thank you. Oh, that's a photo of me from this past summer at an exhibit of La Borinqueña, which is like the Puerto Rican, the Boricua, again, Borinqueña, superhero, and she's also in the DC Comics universe. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Victoria, do we have questions? I'm going to stop sharing just so that we can see you in a bigger version, Nancy, and if we need to, I can share the screen again.
We had a question from Maddie. How did it collapse? I think it was about Arecibo. Kevin answered it, but we can repeat it here. So the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico collapsed.
Yeah. So what happened is that in 2020, so last year, it was actually starting in December of 2019. There were a series of earthquakes happening pretty much constantly for like weeks and months in mostly the southwest of Puerto Rico. But even when we were there in January of last year, we were in San Juan, and we actually felt one that was 5 point something. So all this constant like daily shaking actually brought down something that needed more maintenance, and eventually it collapsed.
I actually want to say that I've been to the Arecibo Observatory, and what surprised me was that because it's a huge dish, or it was, I should say, huge dish, it wasn't smooth the way I had seen dishes before. Because the wavelength they were looking at was long, the greens would grow through the antenna. And I thought, all right, it's long wavelength, but it did surprise me, even though I knew that. It's different to see it in real life. See the weeds going through the antenna. It's like, get down there. You're not supposed to be there.
Yeah, and all that area is so luscious with the greenery. So yeah.
Yes.
Plants have to grow. We have a question from Kevin. Is it known how long ago the Taino people arrived in Puerto Rico?
Oh, this is one of those questions that I need to stop and think of how history is taught in Puerto Rico. And usually the way it's taught is that, so the Tainos were there, and the Caribs or the Caribbees, who were like the warrior types, would come in and attack and the Tainos will be like, oh, okay, come in and attack, and that's fine, and take over, and keep attacking us again. And that pretty much after 1493, which is when Columbus arrives and the whole colonization process happens, that pretty much they were extinct. So there's not, I mean, there's some new publications that have just come out. I can think of, for instance, there's a book about, the title is Contested Caribbean Indigeneity by Sheriana Feliciano Santos, that are trying to collect stories and find more about that background. But in terms of, what you learn, and again, this is me growing up in Puerto Rico in the 80s, it's pretty much like, yeah, they were extinct, and when they got there, they probably came from South America, but not like a whole deep connection around it. So that's one of those areas that I need more research, and I'm glad that more people are publishing about it now.
Yeah, I was putting the link to that.
Okay.
It was interesting. Another question we have is from Georgia. Explain more about the Three Kings Day. What did the celebration look like? What is the story behind it?
Yeah, so the story, so it's connected to Gaspar, Melchor, and Baltasar, so the three wise men, or the Magi, who were bringing gifts to baby Jesus. And so the story has said that they were following the star of Bethlehem to guide them to where they could find baby Jesus, and they were bringing gifts like myrrh and gold and incense. Okay, so they were the gifts that they were bringing. So that is part of the Christian Catholic tradition, and traditionally Puerto Rico, the influence from Spain. It's so Catholicism is the main religion, although there's others more recently. So this is another celebration that it's added to the holiday season, or that is part of the holiday season. So what happens is, just like Christmas Eve, it's like you have like Christmas Eve part 2. So it's like, okay, so then baby Jesus was born, and now it's like about the three kings. And what children do is that, so the night before, so January 5th, you are supposed to get a little box, like a shoe box, and fill it with like maybe grass or some plants, because the three kings are supposed to arrive via camels. Somehow they come through your door via camels somehow. And so you're supposed as a kid to have that like in your room under the bed or somewhere, so that when they come in, so they can feed the camels and keep going to bring gifts to the next house or something. So it's part of that tradition of keeping like this sort of like illusion, and it's a huge celebration. There's actually it's not really a parade, but it's like this kind of like pilgrimage of, there's actually three guys who dress as the Magi, as the three wise men. And it's like a procession, pilgrimage type thing, but it's very festive, going into the town of Juanadillas, which is just to the east of Ponce on the south coast of the island. And children get gifts. And again, if that falls, let's say that January 6th falls on a Wednesday, classes are not going to start on Thursday. That would be rude, right? They're not going to start on Friday, so usually it's the Monday after. So usually people hope for that to actually fall on a Wednesday. And families gather, and there's food and music, and you keep hearing all the music you've been listening to since November. So it's pretty cool. Yeah.
It's like we're hearing Christmas music already.
Yeah.
Months in advance. A question from Maddie is, are they planning to replace or fix the Arecibo Observatory?
I'm not quite sure. I've heard that, like this vague plans. I am not quite sure. I don't know if Jean may have any updates, but I'm not sure what's happening there.
So I know that even before those earthquakes, Arecibo, it was clear that some of the struts, some of the support mechanisms, one of the cables broke, and it was clear that the others definitely needed to be fixed. but I think there was a decision made that it wasn't worth the investment, because there were other things. So what ended up, how the thing broke in the end, was the receiver, this huge receiver that was at the top of the instrument fell, and that's what broke the dish. So my understanding is that there is some conversation about what would be replaced, what could be replaced there. But if I had to guess, I would say this is a long-term prospect, not something that's happening, in the near future.
I don't see any other questions right now. I'll put it out there. It's your last chance. I have a personal question, which is,
Yeah.
of course, this is going to be a very difficult question, but I'm wondering if you can recommend favorite author.
Favorite authors. Well,
Puerto Rican
if you
literature.
like,
It's difficult because that's your expertise.
yeah. Well, I mean, if you like poetry, so Julia de Burgos, I mean, she's been translated by wonderful people like Vanessa Perez. You can find her in translation. So amazing poet. I would say in terms of contemporary authors, there's Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro. You can just find, if you type Yolanda Arroyo, she has tons of publications that some of them are for children. Some, she writes essays and she writes novels and she writes stories, and a lot of them are about affirming so the Afro descendants, or Afro-indigeneity, yes, in a way that all the kind of like biases against dark skin or hair texture, she just turns that around and creates that sense of belonging and pride, and even researching the history, so that those histories, because of slavery, and so that people actually have a sense of having like archival knowledge and preserving memories. So Yolanda Arroyo is wonderful. Mayra Santos is pretty amazing. I would say if you like, if we're thinking then of the diaspora, Nuyorican, there's a lot of wonderful poets from the Nuyorican poets generation, the different generations. Yeah, I could have a long list. So, and again, it also depends on the genre that you prefer, but Mayra Santos, Yolanda Arroyo, Julia de Burgos, many others that I could definitely recommend.
I was thinking fiction, but yes, there's so many different genres.
Yeah, then Mayra Santos, Yolanda Arroyo, so many genres. Well, Rosario Ferré, she's actually in translation, and actually this is La Muñeca Menor, and actually you can find the translation online pretty easily, The Youngest Doll. It's actually a good read for Halloween in a way, because of an intense ending there. Hopefully it won't give you nightmares, but the way it tackles, patriarchy and class, and it's just amazing, especially for someone coming from a very well-known, prestigious family from Ponce, actually the daughter of a former governor, and how, through her art, she's really dismantling some of those oppressive structures. So The Youngest Doll.
Wonderful. Yeah, I put it in the chat. This is great.
Okay.
I have a couple more questions here. Georgia is asking, what was your experience in migrating to the United States? So what was it like?
Well, yeah, and that's why I wanted to acknowledge, the fact that, for someone like me being bilingual, and, my parents, they're working class, but the one thing they wanted to give me was, we're not going to give you material things that we don't have, but at least, that sense of having that bilingual education. So there's always privilege, right? And in any context, we have, power differentials. So in that sense, it's not like, I wasn't forced to leave. It wasn't because of a socioeconomic issue necessarily, or, scarcity because of hurricanes or something like that. But But it is true that when I came here to the Midwest, then without any family, my early 20s, but with that connection that, I could fly back and forth. So it was, there was an adjustment period, but it wasn't like I was completely cut off from culture, from having a network of people.
We have a question from Kevin, who is asking, can you tell us about the Puerto Rican satellite that went into orbit during the past year?
Yeah, so the satellite, it was, that's the one that was launched through SpaceX in late August. So yeah, I haven't heard any updates, but the idea is to have it orbiting for a couple of years. And the way it's set up, it's the latitude so that every so often it can be seen from Puerto Rico.
Oh, and another question from Maddie. What is your favorite place to visit when you're in Puerto Rico?
Old San Juan, of course, just beautiful, wonderful place. Sometimes we go there for just like little getaway, 3-4 days, and we just spend the whole time there. But that is, Puerto Rico is not just Old San Juan. I mean, not by any stretch of the imagination. I really love the southwest part of Puerto Rico, especially Cabo Rojo, which is actually the southwestern tip of Puerto Rico. There is a beautiful, amazing lighthouse. And that when you're up there, you can actually you see like 3 beaches at the same time, because then on the west, you're actually looking at the Mona Passage. The south, you're looking at the Caribbean. There's another beach. And then not too far, there are salt ponds there in that area. And just the geology of the place, it's pretty dramatic when you're there. So and the beaches around it are pretty awesome. So Cabo Rojo, I have also family connections to a few towns over from, Cabo Rojo, between Cabo Rojo and Ponce, Yauco, the town of my mom. So the north is also pretty amazing, especially the Arecibo area and Atillo. I have to say it's been about 20 years since I've been to the southeast, so that's on the agenda for the near future. But yeah, aside from Old San Juan, I would say the southwest for sure.
What about food? I always go back to food.
That's the same thing. I was like, I need to hear something about some food.
Yeah, that's true. I didn't include anything about food. Oh my. So, okay. So I need to preface this by saying that I don't eat meat, right? And a lot of Puerto Rican dishes have meat, although you can always adapt them. So I'm probably not too traditional in my choices here and what I'm going to say, but there is an amazing place, San Juan, where everything is made, or pretty much everything has a chocolate component. Even whatever you're eating, and that's the Chocobar Cortez. I love also, there is this, it's actually deep fried, and it's like this round little things, they look like little fingers, called sorullitos, and they're made with cornstarch, I think it is, harina de maíz, and they're fried, and they just have that crispy flavor. If you like fish, there's one also that is deep fried, like as a snack, but which is called bacalaíto, which the translation would be little cod. That's one I used to like, but I don't really eat fish anyway. I think, let's see what else. Things to drink, right? Like a piña colada. That's pretty cool. It actually would be nice to have a piña colada given the weather we have here, and think of, if we were in Puerto Rico. Let me think. Oh, of course, arroz con gandules. So the Puerto Rican rice, right? That it's kind of like yellowy with pigeon peas. And that's one of the few things that I actually can cook really well. So arroz con gandules for sure, and other, adaptations of things that would have meat on it.
Nice. Yeah, I was going to ask, like, if there's anything that you cook at home that's like something that,
That would be the one thing, and I
Uh-huh.
take a lot of pride in cooking. Yeah, arroz con gandules.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any other questions right now. Do you have any other questions, Jean, or thoughts?
I'm intrigued by and you did do a nice job of explaining the tension between being a Puerto Rican who walks with the U.S. passport and yet feeling a very specific cultural draw. I find that tension interesting. And I wonder if there are people who think we shouldn't be Commonwealth, we should be just a full-on state, or is that a thing?
Oh yeah, it is definitely a thing. So, and this is one of the big debates of, the so-called status quo and the Commonwealth, and people who want statehood, people who want independence. Those are usually what they call the three formulas. And that is actually a topic of tension and debate within families, right? It can really divide families because, people feel very strongly one way or another. So those are there. They're usually attached to political parties. I would say from my end of things that what I would say about, and anybody who's really pro one thing or pro the other, I would say to probably understand where they're coming from, because there's probably that commonality among all of them, so that they're totally convinced, or we are totally convinced that we are doing, or we want what is the best for Puerto Rico. So there is that sense of that cultural affinity, national affinity, regardless of, citizenship and status and all of that, which I think really came through in the summer of 2019, that it wasn't about partisan things. It was, there's a really corrupt government and people came together, and actually that governor was ousted, again, regardless of party affiliation. So I think, from my end, I think right now things are not sustainable. Something needs to change. And I think there needs to be more understanding, at least before there's any change, more understanding, even from the people in Puerto Rico, because if your history is not taught to you in a way that is, that you get to know more about the Taínos, or get to know more about, the African religions and how, with people who were enslaved, and you only get some aspects of the history, or not even understand the 20th century and the fact that having a Puerto Rican flag at home, that would get you into trouble. So understanding all of those aspects so that people are aware of their history, and then individually think, okay, this is what I think it's best given the circumstances. So yeah, I mean, it's very complex, and it can make people get into a very heated debate right away. But I think especially the younger generations, they see that, something needs to change, because it is unsustainable.
Nicely put. Nicely put.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a lot of really new information for me. I think we have one last question from Kevin, who is asking, have you had the chance to see the bioluminescence in the ocean around Puerto Rico?
Sadly not, because even if I grew up there, unfortunately, except for my late aunt, most of the people in my family are not people who like being at the beach or close to the water any time of day. So I've never been to a Noche de San Juan, and sadly I haven't been there to see the bioluminescence that you can see in Lajas, which is southwest corner, sort of, and Fajardo on the eastern tip. So for some other trip.
What is, just because I don't know, what is the bioluminescence from? Is it from seafood or?
I forget exactly how is it or when the time of year when it happens, but it has to do with, I don't have the details, but it's in the water because of the fauna at certain times, then it's like it looks like it's very glowy at night at certain moments. So the bioluminescence that if you type in Parguera, 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 in the town of Lajas, which is in the southwest, you'll find information about the bioluminescence there and also in Fajardo. So yeah, I'm not very sure about the details of how it happened. So I'm not gonna describe something I'm not sure. There's a lot to see. I mean, it's, you know, the island of Puerto Rican, it's just 35 by 100, but there's a lot of things to see and experience and discover.
Well, maybe this is a very nice invitation for people to visit Puerto Rico. I'd like to thank you again, Nancy, for sharing what you know and your enthusiasm. It was very informative and charming to hear the combination of all these cultural aspects, astronomical aspects, and all of that weave together in celebration. So thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
I've been wanting it for a while now because you've been such a frequent person at our shows. This is very exciting. Long-term,
well, thank you so much.
Supporter. Yeah. I think that's a good place to end it. So, yeah.
So we're off live?
We'll say one last goodbye and then we'll end it.
Okay.
Okay. Good night. Buenas noches.
Good night.